Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on climate change and migration, hosted by the Helen Suzman Foundation. Just a bit of background on the webinar. This is a part of our South Africa in the World series, where we recognize that South Africa is no island when it comes to international political, environmental, and economic trends. And what we're trying to do here is explore the ways in which South Africa can itself react to and maybe even play a leading role in responding to those international trends. So the purpose behind the webinars is a series of 3, is to get experts on the topic together in a forum like this to discuss where South Africa stands in relation to certain key international trends and how we might map our responses to them. So today we've got a panel of experts with us, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. We have Professor Chris Nshimbi, and he's the director at the Center for Governance Innovation and associate professor at the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. We've got Ngobeni Nohai, who is a research officer at the International Water Management Institute. Desigan Naidu, who is senior advisor at the World Bank and climate adaptation lead at the Presidential Climate Commission. And facilitating our discussion is Wayne Nge he's the National Director at Lawyers for Human Rights. So I'll hand over to Wayne now to give a short opening statement, and then each of our speakers will give a roughly 10-minute opening statement, and then we'll go back to Wayne for questions. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to facilitate today's webinar. Climate change is becoming an part of my countries. This next interplay between climate change and migration, focusing on both the broader and international dynamics, as well as the specific challenges within South Africa. Today, we'll frame our discussion by looking at 2 interconnected levels, the international and regional level and the South African context. This 2-level approach will help us understand the broader context while also honing in on what happens within our borders. Our expert speakers will guide us through these perspectives and provide insight into what needs to be done at an international and national level to address these urgent issues. Throughout this session, we encourage you to participate actively by sharing your thoughts and questions via the chat function, and we will try to address as many as possible during our question and answer section. Thank you, everyone. I'll hand back over to Chris to lead into our first speaker.
So there are 2 Chris's, yes. I suppose that would be me, the first speaker.
Yes, I would say so.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you so much to the Helen Suzman Foundation for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I'm Chris Nshimbi, as introduced. I'm at the University of Pretoria in the Department of Political Sciences and the Center for the Study of Governance Innovation. I also hold the SACHI chair in the political economy of migration in the SADC region. So I'm going to ask if you can share, Sophie, if you can share my PowerPoint. I've only got 3 slides and that I want to speak to. Yes, will you please move to the second slide, actually. And we can... Okay, so I'm sharing some of the work that we're conducting under the SACHI Chair in Migration and also the Center for the Study of Governance Innovation. This is part of ongoing research, and so First of all, maybe the point that I quickly want to make is that even if we talk about Southern Africa, I think we have to look at it for holistically in the context of the entire continent and even globally. And so if you look at it from a global point of view, the first point that I want to note is that when you talk about migration, generally, broadly, only about 3% of the world population is migrating. 97% is basically kind of sedentary, doesn't migrate. And that figure is also reflected when you come to the continent or the continental level. So if you look at the first slide, I'll ask that you move to the second slide, the one with the map of showing fluxes. No, the one before this one.
Sorry, apologies.
Yes. So this map basically shows fluxes in terms of migration on the African continent. But as I said, the patterns and the levels of migration basically reflect what happens at a global scale. I said 3% of the world population is migrating, and it's the same with Africa. So in other ways, in 2023, for example, there were 33 million people, Africans, that were migrating out of a population of 1.4 billion people. So forget about the news that you hear to say that give you the impression that Africans are migrating en masse, especially going to Europe, for example. Only 33 million out of 1.4 billion people are actually migrating on the continent. But the other thing that you will see from the map there is that actually the majority of migration happens within Africa and not outside of the continent to other places on the continent of the world. And you will see from, so that's upwards of about 75%. Of course, you will find that people in the northern tip of Africa, the Maghreb region, are the ones who actually migrate more towards Europe than towards the part of Africa which is south of the Sahara. But for the populations that are in Africa south of the Sahara, most of those migrate within the continent and not outside the continent. But also from that map, you will see that the migrations are concentrated within the major regions of the African continent. So there's more migration within the ECOWAS region in West Africa. There's more migration within the ECAS region in Central Africa, more migration within the SADC region, the East African region, etc., etc. That's basically the patterns that you find. And also going further down, more migration occurs between neighboring countries, like and not further beyond. So you'll find that there's more migration between Zimbabwe and South Africa, for example, or Malawi and Zambia than occurs between Malawi and Botswana, for example, just by virtue of them being proximate to each other. And even when you go further down, there's more migration that happens within countries of the African members of the African Union. So there's more domestic migration, for example, in terms of rural-urban migration within countries than happens going outside the countries on the continent. So the 2 points that I want to make with regard to the seminar that we have, this webinar, is the fact that when you talk about climate change related movements, they are actually occur within these patterns that are defined by what you see on the map there. So those are broader patterns. And this also includes movements that are induced by conflict and war, for example. And then the other point I would make is that the capability to migrate, so people's ability to migrate, and also the vulnerability to stay and not migrate in the face of climate shocks in Africa will explain 4 key patterns. The first key pattern is the fact that migration that is induced by climate change is not really dominated by households that are poor. is mainly people that have the capability to migrate. They have a bit of resources and they are able to migrate. The ones that are very poor or poor cannot migrate because they don't have the capacity or the capability to migrate. Then long distance domestic migration that is caused by climate change is more prevalent than local migration or international migration. So mostly when you talk about climate-induced migration, it happens within a country, but all over a long distance than short or localized distance, and also not across countries to go to other countries. Then we have notions of slow onset and not rapid onset changes, which are more likely to cause migration. The rapid ones, mostly people will be relocated after let's say a flood, but eventually they come back. The ones that are slow, they are the ones that are more likely to cause people to migrate over a long period. Then the impacts of climate shocks or their severity on migration are not linear. This we need to emphasize. So they are influenced by the dominant, either if we talk about the capability to migrate or the vulnerability of staying and not migrating. These two factors will determine what will cause. But then there's a combination of other factors or drivers like the social, economic, political structures. So they work together. And then, so that's basically what you get. And if you move to the second slide, that slide speaks in terms of when we start to think about what is the future like. What we note first of all is that when our concern with regards to people, the impacts of climate change on in relation to migration, is that our focus normally is on groups that are vulnerable or areas or locations that are vulnerable. And we are trying to understand how they will respond to climate events in that regard. I hope my map is clear there. But another point that I would make also, we are focused on South Africa, but then we need to note also that much as we talk about South Africa is not the only country on the African continent or even the SADC region that receives migrants. People migrate to all other countries in the region and also across the African continent. That has to be borne in mind. But then the link between climate-induced migration and the drivers is very complex. It's not straightforward. We can't really exactly establish that link, although we can make some points, not some points. If you look at that map, for example, there, the fact that tropical regions in Africa south of the Sahara are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts, and that has an effect on when you combine with the other factors, like the social, the economic, the political, that can drive migration. Then the impacts or the effects are particularly defined in tropical areas. So there are issues that relate to people that rely so much on crop production. For example, there are temperature rises or changes in temperature. There's the issue of rainfall patterns that for example, this year you'll see that in the southern part of Africa, we have a drought situation. So all those factors come into play and they determine or impact on people's capability or ability to migrate. And then, of course, there are issues of people that are vulnerable, as I said, people that depend on agriculture, especially, or whose livelihoods depend on agriculture. And then there are issues of institutions as well that we need to point out. So if countries have climate resilient infrastructure, for example, it means that even if you have these changes, people may not likely be able to migrate, or may not likely desire to migrate or decide to migrate because they are able to contain the changes. Issues of education also come into play, limited financial resources, and so on and so forth. So a combination of climatic events and social, economic, and political factors affect vulnerability or vulnerable populations, and then will determine whether they migrate due to changes in climate. So we need to actually understand the interaction of climate change with other drivers of migration, and these are areas that we're trying to investigate and trying to understand. Now, going into the future to say what are we likely to see moving forward, if may you please move to the last slide. Again, speaking of complex drivers of migration in Africa, it's very difficult for us to be able to tell where people are going to be going or who is going to be migrating in view of climate change impacts. But these are the things that we are investigating. It's possible to explore the evolution of the complexity. First of all, to note the fact that temperature changes that give rise to long-term climate change. And here by long-term, I mean periods of, let's say, 50 years, not just 1 year or 2 years. These could trigger people to, if you look at that map, they may trigger people to move towards the poles. This map was designed based on a study by our future studies expert in the center. So you will see therefore that in terms of the poles that people are likely to move towards, we're talking about South Africa, we're talking about Botswana, we're talking about Zimbabwe. That's one possibility that the movement will be triggered towards. The movements could also be triggered towards the coasts. So we're talking about the western coast of Africa, we're talking about the eastern coast and also the southern coast. That's another possibility. Then also movements in the third place may be triggered in towards cooler central areas of the continent. So here we're talking about areas that are plateaus, highlands, like in the Great Lakes region, Ethiopia, somewhere there, Southern Africa as well. And just to end on this point, just 2 points to note from that slide is that rises in temperature could adversely rather affect natural resources and sustainability of natural environments for agriculture. Most people in Africa depend on agriculture. And so where you have decreasing rainfall, for example, in Southern Africa, that would trigger these movements in the long term. And here again, I repeat, long term, 50 years, not 1 year or something like that. Then, of course, the future of migration in Africa is shaped by a combined trends and disruptions. As I said, migration decisions or decisions to migrate are not determined by weather only, but a host of other socio-economic and cultural factors, the desire to move or the desire to stay. Lastly, there is the question of now attitudes towards migrants, especially in how does that impact the notion of governance of climate-induced migration. I won't take long on this one. I'll just briefly say that if you consider it at two levels, first of all, at the level of people that are responsible for making policies that would govern the movements of people across the region, within South Africa, across the continent, but also you look at it at the level of people on the ground who interact one with another, in terms of maybe you have migrants who move on the basis of being affected by climate change. So when we look at the African continent as a whole, and even Southern Africa, and the policy makers or the people that are responsible for making policy that relates to migration, we can distinguish between two approaches. There's a group of countries that approach migration as a security issue, and then there's a group of countries that see migration as a tool for development. So that distinction also actually kind of filters down to the perceptions and the attitudes of people on the ground towards migrants. So where migrant is viewed as an issue of security posing threats, then similarly the people on the ground in terms of their response to migrants or migration will kind of be reflected. in the way they treat migrants, where migration is viewed as a means of or a tool for development. I don't like saying it's a tool for development, but still, you will find that the attitude towards migrants will be different or will follow suit in that order. I think I'll stop there and wait for question and answer.
No, thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to introduce our second speaker, who would be touching on the issues around internal migration in the context of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So, like Wayne said, I've been tasked to look at internal migration and resource scarcity within the Southern African borders, but also really focus on South Africa. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Ngowenani Nohai. I am a senior research officer in water governance and policy at the International Water Management Institute. I'm also a PhD candidate in water conflict and resilience. So, really, for me, and I think what I hope to achieve today is to really also highlight what communities are going through. And through my research, I've been privileged to witness but also experience how climate change is no longer just an environmental issue. It's actually a force that intensifies socio-economic instability and migration. So particularly in the region, the effects of climate change, like droughts, like floods, amplify already existing challenges over scarce resources, driving people to move, but sometimes within borders and sometimes externally. So I often say this, it's easy to focus on numbers, right? But for me, and what I've seen is that behind every statistic, behind every glossy report, there are actually real people who are being uprooted every day by these environmental changes. Now, while climate events like droughts are a significant push factor, migration results from multiple pressures, as alluded to by Prof. Chris. Now these multiple pressures are socio-economic hardships, these are political instability, these are pre-existing vulnerabilities that climate change worsens, right? And I always like to bring in a bit of examples so that people can actually see where I'm going with this, right? So let's take, for example, Mozambique, right? Looking at resource competition and conflict. So in Southern Africa, specifically in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, now, this is a dynamic situation here where the region's natural resources are being depleted. And on top of that, there's violent conflict that has led to widespread internal displacement, right? Not so much migration, but displacement. So now climate change really worsens this by making agriculture increasingly unviable. That drives people from rural to urban environments to seek safety, but also opportunities, right? So, on top of this, the discovery of natural gas reserves has ignited even more disputes over control, right? There's rebel groups who have taken over this region. And the region is also vulnerable to cyclones, right? And now what we are seeing is that urban areas like Pemba, like Nampula province, are overwhelmed by an influx of internally displaced persons, right? Now we're lacking the infrastructure to support them. Now, this part for me is broader. It's a part of a broader global pattern where climate change worsens resource scarcity and social political tensions, thereby creating complex displacement, but also migration challenges, right? Now, let me also come to South Africa, right? In South Africa, climate-induced internal migration presents its own set of challenges, right? Now, let's take, for example, KZN in 2022, the floods in 2022, one of the most devastating floods. And I mean, in a matter of days, lives were lost, people were displaced. And now entire communities were left without homes, right? Infrastructure was destroyed and economic livelihoods were shattered. Families, in their desperation, migrated, right? Others were displaced, of course. Others migrated to find safety, but also resources, right? And then on the other hand, droughts in provinces like where I'm from, the Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, have triggered internal migration as farmers lose their livelihoods. Communities that rely on agriculture face a serious threat when it comes to rainfall patterns. So now what we've seen over the years, for example, again, going back to 2018, the drought in the Eastern Cape, it led to severe water shortages, making it impossible for rural population to sustain their way of life. Now, this led to an increased rural to urban migration as people sought better opportunities and basic access to services. Now, how do I connect these together? Now, looking at Mozambique and the internal migration and also looking at South Africa, a broader pattern emerges that I mentioned earlier. Climate change and resource scarcity are accelerating internal migration across fragile settings worldwide, right? It's not just about people moving from rural to urban settings, but really it's about increasing pressure on communities and urban centers already struggling to meet their basic needs, right? I mentioned resource competition can escalate into conflict as seen in Mozambique, but also seen from Ethiopia. I was in the Somali region just 3 weeks ago, and I see how, this resource competition, leads to conflict, leads to tension, and I think for us to really address this climate-induced internal, external, we need more than just immediate humanitarian response. I think we at a point where we need to develop comprehensive policy solutions that integrate environmental and social political factors, right? Now, this includes better resource management, conflict resolution, and climate change adaptation strategies. And what I've seen is that, anticipatory actions are some of the key disaster risk management approaches that have been gaining traction over recent months or years. And really what is happening there is that, these anticipatory action combined with early warning systems help communities, but also government to prepare for and adapt to climate changes, thereby minimizing the risk of forced displacement and hopefully migration as well. But so, really investing in early warning system and disaster risk reduction is something that I think we really need to focus on. But also more than anything else, and Dr. Chris has just mentioned this, is that our policies are not aligned with reality. And I think that is the biggest challenge we face through my research at the CSIR. Now at IMI, we are saying the same thing. We are seeing the same thing. Our policies are not aligned with realities on the ground. So we need more coordination. We need more. And I always say, perhaps we need to think out the box, or perhaps, remove the box and think strategically. How can we, develop policies that actually integrate these realities? And more than anything else, I think we need to scale up measures that integrate these policies into not just national but also local strategies to ensure communities are better equipped. Because if communities can adapt to climate change, then perhaps it will reduce the number of people that are crossing borders. So really, by acting early, I think we can really, reduce the need for reactive displacement and protect vulnerable populations. And just to really wrap up, I think more than anything else, we need to be prepared for the realities of a changing climate. By focusing on building long-term resilience and adapting to these challenges, we can reduce the number of forced migration, but also create more secure future for people. And I think more than anything else, as I wrap up, it's time for us to move from recognizing the problem, because I think we know what the problem is, and to really start implementing solutions that are sustainable, but also inclusive. Thank you so much. And over to you, Wayne.
No, thank you very much for that insightful contribution. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions regarding that. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Mr. Naidoo, who will give us a general view on how states can respond to cross-border and internal migration due to climate change. Hand over to him now.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the other presenters for some very interesting inputs. And I want to immediately react to some of them and then build on that. The first issue is about the modesty of numbers. And I appreciate that Chris and his team do actual counting as opposed to modeling and speculating. But the range between what he talks about and what is in the official papers of things like UN documents like the IOM, where the IOM is talking about the movement of 2 billion people by 2100, on the back of a broader category, and that broader category is environmental degradation, is that we clearly need to do a lot more work around getting to what the reality of the numbers actually are. The second issue is that the numbers matter and they don't. I mean, if you consider the number of immigrants that come into South Africa, it is indeed a very small percentage. But we also reflect on how big an issue this was in the run-up to the last election. And in fact, it continues to be. So there's an emotive sentiment associated with it that actually decouples itself from what the numbers may actually be. But let's re-examine where we are with climate change. And I think this is important. We were, and some of us continue to, talk about the possibility of a plus 1.5 degrees Celsius change increase in global temperature by 2100. This is what is agreed to in the Paris Agreement, signed to by all members, all countries and territories that are members of the United Nations. And some people talk about that as still being a viable target. The reality, however, is that the audited figures for 2023 is that we were already globally at plus 1.48 degrees. Parts of the world, like the Caribbean, were higher than that. The Caribbean was 1.64. And then on the back of that, you have an acute effect and a stealth effect. The acute effect is around these major events, climate-related disaster events, usually extreme weather events, but not exclusively weather events. You also have, on the back of that, violent extremism and conflict as a very real phenomenon in areas that have had drastic and repeated and sometimes exponential changes in local climates, usually associated with the water scarcity, but also about the change in soil structure to make it unviable to continue economic activity in that space. And on the back of that, you've had mobility of people. Most of the mobility we still think is temporary, that people will go away for relief and return, but a fair amount is already permanent. So the projections around the growth of populations in the coastal cities, the biggest cities in the African continent, is now sitting at 40%. The overall average is less than 1/3 of that, of course, which is showing you that there is a movement that is happening there to very particular environments. And in those particular environments, the viability of an easier climate-related livelihood is more possible than the place you left. And so the pull-push factor will see people maybe operating like more classical migrants, of being there in the working part of the year and then taking 2 months to go to whatever is considered home. So there's a big shift in the nature of the patterns that we are seeing. And I'm sure Chris, and I'm sure Imi as well, may well be interested in examining this phenomenon a lot further. I know there's a bunch of work done in Imi and was in fact presented at World Water Week 2.5 weeks ago, examining some of these phenomena as they relate to water-related conflict, and it's really excellent work. The second bunch of factors that I want to address is that we have to understand that climate change has this effect in multiple directions. There is a direct impact on the environment. We know this very well. The bits that are less examined, and something that we are engaging robustly, and the we is a broader community of practice everywhere in multiple disciplines, is how climate change is impacting economies, how it's impacting social fabrics in societies, and how it is affecting security status. So the AU Peace and Security Council, and it's been quite innovative in the way it has engaged this issue, has organized itself to pronounce on two factors associated with climate change. The first is the declaration in 2021 as an organ of the AU, and then eventually became the statement of the AU itself, that climate change, at the very minimum, is a threat multiplier in these multiple domains, and in some domains is an actual trigger and catalyst. The second is, they said, we need to examine this in a nexus, and that nexus is climate, development, and security, and organize for our planning, for example, with Agenda 2063, the next version, to be intimately connected with the notion of a nexus as we move forward. So what do we do about this at a policy level? Because there is an inherent tension. Because the logic says that, like we talk about climate change in general, that the notion of global solidarity is what will take us to a safer place. We know this is not happening. We have for the longest time trying to beat out a decent enough deal to reduce carbon emissions, and we're not there, in spite of the fact that we had a pretty decent blueprint at COP3 in Kyoto that resulted in the Kyoto Protocol, and that was 1997. So the ability to get the global solidarity formula working is not getting much easier as we're moving along. The second issue associated with that is the world as a whole is very stuck in a security-first paradigm, and a national security-first paradigm at that. We're seeing it in Europe with the reaction to the war in Ukraine. We're seeing it in the United States right now as a key feature in the presidential election campaigns. We have seen this as actual election results in the European elections, including the elections to the EU Parliament. So on the one hand, you have a formula that clearly can work around global solidarity, where as a community of practice globally, we get together and organize our thinking on how to accommodate refugees, not put them on a plane and fly them off to some other African country, as some places in the world are doing, but something much more sophisticated, and harvesting what migration might mean for the recipient of that harvesting in a very important way. You know, one good case study example, which I thought would be brought up, is what's happening with the Uganda refugees. And Uganda has a very high refugee count, not on the back of climate change, but on the back of the local conflict in the Great Lakes region of 1.7 million people. And IMI is in fact doing a project there right now examining some of these issues. So how do we organize for the balance between this global solidarity and security first? Now, in the South African environment, that conflict plays itself out in policy as well. So the policy that brings it together around the solidarity paradigm is the Just Transition Framework for South Africa's decarbonization, or South Africa's move to a higher resilience around climate. And in the Just Transition Framework, which talks to procedural justice and organizing for equal beneficiation of the products associated with climate change transitions, as well as the restorative justice component implies very strongly that there will be no discrimination against migrants in the way we handle our move to a lower carbon economy. And the transition that is currently an energy transition that eventually will need to be a transition in multiple areas. And then you contrast that with South Africa's very enthusiastic policies around border management, around illegal migration, without organizing for reform of the processes to allow people to become legal migrants in that space. So there's a series of tensions that we have to work through inside these domains. And it does require not only innovative thinking, and this time policy innovation, in addition to the other innovations that we know, but it does require us to have a very different view of the world as we go into the future. So maybe the last point to make is this, is that the rate of change in the weather patterns on the back of the broader climate change phenomena is happening exponentially. And because it is happening exponentially, we don't have decades to work this out. We might have a few years to work this out in a reasonable way. And we can take flags from places that are not too far away from us. So, for example, IGAD organized itself around the Kampala Declaration, which takes a very positive view and a very progressive view on how to deal with the concept of climate migration. Chair, I'll pause at that point and look forward to the discussion.
Everyone for your questions. I'm just checking to see if there are any questions from the audience for now. And before I start asking some questions, maybe I'll just give a second to see if any come up. It doesn't look like it. Okay, so thank you all for your presentations, and I think it's obviously a topic that requires a lot more time than you all had, but you all touched on so many different issues. And maybe I'll start with one question for everyone, for each person, but you're all free to answer any of the questions. So Chris, you mentioned that only a small percentage of the population migrates, and most migration occurs with this. How do these patterns inform policy development, in particular in South Africa? And so that's just one question in terms of the feeding policy. I'll give another one, which is around Goenani, you had also mentioned that climate change amplifies resource scarcity and contributes to conflict. How can we develop policies that address both climate impacts and the underlying socioeconomic drivers of migration? And lastly, Ms. Naidu, you touched on a lot of different issues that I probably wanted you to expand on. But maybe we can talk about the just transition framework in South Africa. And given the rapid changes in the weather patterns and the urgency of this crisis, how can we ensure policies like the grants just transition align with the realities of migration, and particularly talking about the cognitive dissonance or the separation between the emotive political discussion around migration and the realities of it? Is there fear, and this is an added on, is there a fear that that kind of populist political discussion around migration might interfere with the policy frameworks? Maybe let's start there. I'll hand over, and maybe we can all answer in the same order that we spoke. If you can all touch on all the questions or the one specific to you.
Okay, my response is very short, very brief with regards to the way in which the realities on the ground might influence policy. If you remember the first map that shows the fluxes that I shared, there's a lot of dynamism in terms of people moving in West Africa and also in East Africa. And that in itself also speaks to the way in which policymakers there respond to the movements of people, to the extent that they actively craft policies that are designed to govern migration. But in areas where you don't see those fluxes or the active dynamism, also it's reflected in the absence of policy. So in the SADC region, for example, we don't have a protocol. We still have a draft protocol which was drafted over 2 decades ago, or about 2 decades ago, and it's not yet been ratified. And that in itself tells you, at least it gives you a hint on how the countries in the region approach migration or their attitude towards migration. But when you look at East Africa, the East African community, you look at ECOWAS, you see they actively revising their policies on migration. because their approach to migration is different from what. But then you have also to think of it in terms of the entire continent. I mean, we currently are talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area. Much as the focus tends to be on exchanging goods and services, we do have to realize that part of the movements also consist in the movement of people. So this is an issue that countries on the continent, in the regions, have to grapple with and address. There've been efforts, I mean, in the past, I'm sure you know about the African passport, but up to now, it hasn't really materialized. And so again, the dissonance between the aspirations of the people on the ground, be it business persons or people that want to migrate in search of labor, and also the policies of people at the policy making level. There seems to be a disconnect in that sense. I think that's what I would say in response to your question.
No, thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. My turn already?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so, this is a bit, let me start by saying this, right? Like I said, how climate change is a stress multiplier, right? For existing vulnerabilities such as poverty, inequality, political instability, and weak governance. So for me, and the work that we've been doing at IMI is that, policies need to start with a comprehensive analysis that looks beyond immediate climate impacts to address underlying socio-economic and political drivers of vulnerability. So, for example, addressing rural poverty, strengthening governance, but also improving land tenure systems can reduce the pressure that lead to conflict and migration. So, for example, in South Africa, people are always talking about how there's a lot of migrants coming into South Africa, but perhaps we need to look at, yes, they're coming in, but within South Africa, what inequalities exist? Because oftentimes when we talk about migration, climate-induced migration, displacements, people move. For example, the work that I do in Mozambique, people are displaced in communities that already have limited resources, that being water, that being land, but also rooted in other vulnerabilities like poverty and inequality. So already that intensifies, existing challenges. And that's one of the things that I think we need to sort of understand, why is there so much tension, when people are coming into South Africa, but we need to also be cognizant of the fact that we have our own existing vulnerabilities that need to be analyzed, but also, responded to. Another one before I call it is around international and regional cooperation. Regional cooperation on issues like shared water resources, migration patterns, but also disaster response can help address common challenges in a more coordinated manner, I think. International frameworks such as the Paris Agreement, also offer opportunities to address both climate and also socioeconomic vulnerabilities through global partnerships. And I think just to wrap up, but really integrating such, policies can, be more effectively address not only the immediate impacts, but really the deeper underlying, factors that drive vulnerability, conflict, and migration. I know we're pressed for time, so I'll just end it here for now. Thank you.
Chair, I'm going to just weigh in. Is that okay? Yep. Yeah, just to react to a few things. First, to agree strongly with Chris that in this domain, Southern Africa in general and South Africa in particular is lagging way behind other parts of the continent. COMISA's got it together in a reasonable way. At least it's starting to make the right kind of pronouncements, at the very least examining the right issues. West Africa, in turn, in fact, organizing for the entire Sahel and having the Sahel Climate Commission that's going across 17 countries right across the band west into East Africa, examining these issues with sobriety and in a connected way with a joint mega project. And that mega project is the Great Green Wall. It's starting to unify not only the thinking, but the policy environment and many of the actions associated with it. SADC is simply not in that game. It is not engaging this seriously enough. In fact, it was an absent player in the African negotiations around putting a position together for the UN Security Council. And this must be accounted for. The second issue that I want to put on the plate is that South Africa tends to be ahistorical. You know, its similarity with the US in this regard is quite astounding. This country's economic development, like the US's economic development, was on the back of mega contributions of different settler nations that came and built up this thing called the South African nation. More recently, migratory labor held up the real force of the South African economy for the better part of centuries, actually, the mining industry. And we suddenly adopted an ahistorical stance around migration, with organizing to look at migrants as a burden rather than a boon, in a time when the region will need it more than ever. We're sitting in a region right now where 8 countries are coming out of a drought on the brink of a food security crisis. 2 countries have actually declared these as national emergencies. And in that environment, not expecting to play a solidarity role inside the region is just not on. Further, the climate resilience of South Africa depends on how the entire region responds. Climate does not respect political boundaries. It works, its micro level is region by region. And this is something that we really, really have to organize to invest in. And the way that we have to get this through is that South Africa has very usefully adopted from the IPCC report this notion of climate resilient development pathways for locations and for sectors. And there's a lot of work happening right now with the water sector and climate smart agriculture and climate smart built environment, etc., which is great. We now need to take that into a locational base that is bigger than the country. And within that conversation, have a serious engagement of how the free movement protocol, or at least certain aspects of it, is going to organize for us collectively to have a much higher level of climate resilience than we currently do, or that we can have if people are not moving at all. Because the thing that South Africans are not cottoning on to is that while right now there's a net migration inwards towards South Africa, that may not be a phenomenon that lasts forever. We may well need to move in the other direction as well. And by the time we need to do that, we better have friends next door. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure we have enough time for an additional question since we're meant to finish in a minute. And so maybe what I'll do is I will close off by thanking all the speakers. I think this is a very important discussion and should be probably have a lot more follow-up discussions around this. The urgencies of the issues that you've raised cannot be overstated, and the need for solidarity and how we look at this very complex issue is important. And obviously, Mr. Naidoo's chilling words and how climate change might make South Africa a push nation in the future. It is important that we reconcile how we address migration as a whole, not just climate migration, so that if and when we need solidarity from others, as we have in the past, we'll still have friends in and around the region. Thank you again to all our speakers and participants. Let's continue this conversation and work together to creating a more resilient, inclusive, and just policies that meet the challenges of our time. I'll hand over to Chris to give final comments.
Thanks so much, Wayne. And I just want to extend such a warm thank you to all of our speakers and our facilitator for a really enriching discussion. I do feel like we only got halfway through, and I think that's a great feeling at the end of a webinar, rather that than the opposite. So let's hope that this will not be the last time that we create a platform to discuss these issues. And thank you also to the HSF team who worked hard putting this, both the design, the research, and the logistics for this webinar together. That's Sophie, Luke, and Ezekiel. Thank you very much. And I think on that note, we can go. What's the opposite of live? We can cut the feed now and pick up any discussion offline over email if we want. Thank you, everyone.